Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we've got a nice little 4-game slate for college basketball. Now this slate, we have 2 higher scoring games and 2 lower scoring games. We have Robert Morris and Uwe Pui. I have Robert Morris winning this game. This is the lowest scoring game on the slate though. Colgate over Army, and Colgate is the second highest scoring game on the slate. Southern and Boston College is the other lower scoring game. And then New Mexico and Oral Roberts. This is actually the highest scoring game on the slate, which I have New Mexico winning. It's also the tightest game on the slate. The other 3 have at least 8-point spreads or more. So overall, I think this slate is pretty okay. It's not great, but it's okay. There's plenty of value, though, so you can mix and match players that you want to fit in the lineups here. And we have a pretty solid slate as a result of that. So let's get into the players I do like. We're going to start with guards here. And we're going to start with Oliver Lynch-Daniels for Colgate. Now, since starting, he's been over 12 fantasy points every game. He's had 7 out of the last 12 games, over 20 fantasy points, including 4 of the last 6. And he's had 2 games against Army in his career, and they were over 12 fantasy points as well. His price point is pretty reasonable here for this particular slate. He's not a must-play. He's averaging 0.73 fantasy points per minute, but he is viable on the slate being a starter. Then we're going to look at Donovan Dent for New Mexico here. I really like New Mexico today, and so he's definitely somebody I'm interested in. He plays about 15 to 20 minutes a game. He has very nice upside, but he does have a low floor, so you do have to keep that in mind because he has had some games under 5 fantasy points. But he does have 20 plus fantasy point potential in certain matchups, and this is a pretty good matchup for him. Then we'll look at Jalen House here for New Mexico. He's one of my favorite plays on the slate. He has only had 1 game all season under 20 fantasy points. He has some really good upside at over 40 fantasy points, and he's gotten a lot of steals this season. He's been stealing the ball quite a bit. He's one of the few guards that are over 1 point fantasy points per minute, and he checks in at 1.19 fantasy points per minute. So he's a guy that I'm really going to try to work into my lineup. Then we're going to look at Enoch Cheeks here for Robert Morris. Now, he has no games all season under 22 fantasy points, which gives him some nice upside. He's also averaging 1 fantasy point per minute on the season, which is really tough for guards typically, and he's playing 30-plus minutes a game. He's also played well in easy to tough matchups, and while his team is expected to win this game, it's one of the lower scoring games on the slate, but he has enough upside here, which makes him viable here. He is not quite got as much upside as House does, but he's pretty close, and so he's a viable alternative if you don't want to pay up for House or you need it to save a little bit of money. Then we're going to look at Tucker Richardson for Colgate. Now, he's one of my favorite plays on the slate as well. He's a great price here. He's only had 1 game under 24 fantasy points all season long, and he's got 10 games versus Army in his career, and in those games, he has had 7 straight over 24 fantasy points, which is quite amazing. So I expect him to have a really solid game here. He knows how to play them. Of course, they know him as well, but he's averaging 0.91 fantasy points per minute, which is really good for a guard. And his price is a little bit cheaper than Cheeks or House, and a good play based on that price as well. And then we're going to look at Michael Green for Robert Morris. Now, he doesn't start here, so he's one of the few guys that I'm looking at here that's not a starter. But he's played 22 minutes a game on average, and he's averaging, he's only had 2 games all season under 10 fantasy points. So he's been really solid for the most part. He has a little bit of a downside. His floor is pretty low, but he has a good ceiling, and I think he's viable on this slate considering the fact that he's cheap enough that you just need him to get around 10 fantasy points to really pay off, and he has nice upside as a result. And Robert Morris is a team, even though that it's the lowest scoring game on the slate, they have a good amount of points. They're one of the higher scoring teams on the slate in general. So overall, I think he's still viable here. Then we're going to look at our forwards, and we're going to start with Odeze, Morris Odeze for New Mexico. Now, He has had one bad game all season long at the end of December, but he's been at least 18 fantasy points every other game this season. He's had a couple games with foul trouble issues, but overall he has 50 fantasy point upside. His price is just too cheap for this matchup. His last game against them, at Oral Roberts, he had 24 fantasy points, and of course New Mexico is expected to win, and he's averaging 1.08 fantasy points per minute. He's one of my core plays on this particular slate, just based on his potential here. And then we're going to look at Khalil Spear for Robert Morris. Now his team is expected to win, but it is a low-scoring game. But in the entire season, he's only had one game under 20 fantasy points, which was the first game of the season where he had one. And then since then, he's got double-double potential. He's averaging 0.93 fantasy points per minute, and he has some big games against Uipui in the past. So I really like him on the slate. Then we're going to look at Jeff Woodward, for Colgate. He was averaging a ridiculous 1.13 fantasy points per minute, and he's only $5,000. And of course, the catch here is he plays 17 to 20 minutes a game. He has a little bit of a floor risk because he's had a couple off games, but overall, he has some nice upside for his price, and he has some good potential here. The minutes are really the only concern here, but he's had 6 games versus Army, all of them over 13 fantasy points, and 3 of them over 22. I think he'll likely have a good opportunity here to have a ladder, because this is one of the higher scoring games on the slate, and I expect Colgate to win as well. And then we're going to look at Chris Mann for Army, who's also has a pretty good potential as well. He's had a couple of rough games all season, but he has upside in this matchup around 25 fantasy points, and he's had 2 games versus Colgate in the past where he had 18 or more fantasy points, so I think he's viable on the slate, but not quite as good as Woodward, obviously. And then finally, Josiah Alec. If you want to have another guy that you could offset from Chris Mann, he's around the same price point at 6,000, and he's decently priced here. I wish he was a little bit lower, but overall, in 3 games versus Oral Roberts in his career, he's averaged at least 13 fantasy points per game. He had 1 game over 30 fantasy points, and the other 2 were over 13. So I think he's in a good spot here. He plays a good amount of minutes, and he has some upside as a result of that. But his price is a little bit high for what I like. But honestly, there's just not a ton of forwards that I love today. So he's somebody to consider at a decent price point, though. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.